How dull.
There is no getting around it. 2024 sucked for video games. Nothing good came out. Nothing, unless you were a Nintendo fan. If you were a fan of gaming PCs or PlayStation or Xbox, you got absolutely nothing. And the absolute worst games of the year will be showcased here today on the Luigis for 2024.
All right, let's get the most boring, generic, uninspired, basic thing out of the way first. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered did come out this year. I know no one talks about this game. I know no one cares about this game. I know it didn't do well on PlayStation or PC. I know, like, the game journos have done everything in their power to kind of retroactively claim this game to be an underappreciated masterpiece, but in reality, it is and always has been a complete mess. And all of the re-releases, all of the shilling, the HBO show last year, everything they've done has just been leading up to this wet fart of a re-release. They did not magically find a new audience by re-releasing on the PS5. Everyone who has been paying attention to The Last of Us knows that Naughty Dog and PlayStation as a whole is a dying platform that is simply not capable of competing with Nintendo anymore. This is a company that's been on the decline for over a decade and is just running on fumes. And although there are a handful of people who will religiously stick by them no matter what, releases like this really showcase what the problem actually is when it comes to PlayStation releases. Not only was this title poorly received to begin with, they're re-releasing it when they really didn't need to. I know people who were upset when they re-released the remastered version of The Last of Us Part 1. And then they did it again on the PS5, and now they're remastering the sequel. It doesn't matter how many times you re-release this game. It isn't magically going to become popular. And that is, of course, like simply the meta aspect of this release. At its actual core, as we all know, The Last of Us is simply not a very good game and never has had a genuine popular audience. If there's a game company that I'm glad is failing in 2024, I'm glad it's WB. Because 10 years ago, I had to deal with people trying to tell me that Arkham City was one of the best games ever made. It was one of the best superhero titles ever made. Batman is this iconic, legendary figure in fiction, when in reality, he's some cheap knockoff of the Scarlet Pimpernel, Sherlock Holmes, and the Shadow, with none of the appeal that made those characters popular to begin with. Batman sucks, and his entire extended universe reflects that fact. Like, I don't know who the Suicide Squad is. I don't know who the Justice League is. I don't know, like, why these people are fighting each other. I don't know why characters that were killed, like, back in the Arkham games are back in this one, even though it supposedly takes place in the same continuity. You know, the problems with Suicide Squad have nothing to do with the gas features or the setup or the mechanics. The issue is that Western superhero fiction isn't very well thought out to begin with. It isn't interesting. It's not fun. The characters don't have interesting storylines. When I compare this to really well-made, interesting games from Asian cultures, like even like superhero fiction, Sentai, for example, you really see like a maturity and intelligence that just isn't present in this degenerate genre. Like when I look at DC, like I don't look at this game and think of missed opportunities. I think of just how fundamentally these characters just really aren't all that interesting, and how I am very sick and tired of seeing them shoved everywhere. This game and the studio behind it deserve to fail. Before Gamergate, I think a lot of people were giving indie games the benefit of the doubt. People thought these were passionate projects that were coming from people who love games, who wanted to make their own unique titles that really would not exist in the mainstream. And that narrative persisted for years up until Gone Home came out and kind of dismantled the entire thing. Like, people have learned to hate minor, low budget indie games, but a lot of people, myself included, really had no idea just how bad get the early major indie games actually were. I think Fez has gotten a reputation for being a niche game for a niche audience, and people don't really care about it or its creator anymore. But Braid was something that I remember being propped up as an example of what makes indie gaming great. Something that really showcases the power of creativity and had a really charming, unique story. Imagine my surprise when 15 years after release, I finally get around to playing this and realize it's just some subversive Mario game that takes itself super seriously. Like, oh, what if the princess didn't want to be rescued? Ooh, is it that deep? Ooh. it's the most sad knockoff derivative project I've ever seen in my life, with nothing really charming or creative about it, right? The story isn't interesting, the characters aren't fun, there's no originality or creativity. It's shocking playing this and realizing just how much of a knockoff it is of the Mario property. And that's just like the core game as a whole. Like, for those of you who played the game when it first came out, you got this re-release that really offered nothing of substance. The game, like, the developers spent a lot of time and money giving an extended commentary on, like, the supposed meaning of the game, but I think if the game was actually well executed and interesting, like, players would figure all that out for itself. To me, and I think this is true for Jonathan Blow as a whole, like, I think the Jonathan Blow doesn't understand the appeal of video games. To me, the fact Jonathan Blow seems to think the story should take center focus when it comes to games, and this game is proof that that does not work. Susie Hunter was in it. That's all I need to say. Don't buy this game. Don't care about it. I won't even tell you the title. If Susie Hunter's in anything, you should not ever respect it or its creators. That we're on the subject of Susie Hunter, let's talk about the other game that he was in this year, Dragon's Dogma 2. In general, Capcom has really been utilizing this transgender former porn star to promote their games, and it really does show in the quality, because Capcom has just been going downhill over the past several years. Ever since DMC5 came out, it feels there was a period of time where people were acting like they were on a roll, that they were putting out banger after banger, that they were like on top of their game. But, actual connoisseurs like myself understood that that was not true. And I think Dragon's Dogma is a really good indication of just how poor of a situation the company is actually in. Right? When you look at how the audience spent over a decade hyping up Dragon's Dogma 2, pretending it was the greatest action RPG ever made, saying it was some misunderstood masterpiece, like, just wait till the sequel, guys. They're going to fix all the problems. They're going to fix the clunkiness. They're going to make it more interesting. It's going to shine. It's going to be amazing when they get around to making it, right? That was the narrative right from the get-go in regards to Dragon's Dogma 2. People were expecting great things even when the first game was still new, right? But after several re-releases of the first game, after an MMO that never left Asia, Dragon's Dogma 2 finally got made. And what did we get? It took us a decade to get a lazy, uninspired rehash of the original Dragon's Dogma, which with no innovations to speak of at all, which was just kind of the same thing we had seen already,
It's crazy to look back on, but Tekken 8 was actually going to be the first ever major AAA game that I had pre-ordered on Steam. That's right. I was actually going to buy this one because I reasonably enjoyed Tekken 7. I thought the series was on the up and up. I thought they were going to correct things and make improvements and continue to be the best fighting game, non-Nintendo fighting game, I should say, on the market. But what ended up happening was that Tekken 8 was a complete and utter disaster. Like, in pretty much every regard. Not only is the gameplay not at all an improvement over 7, not only have they failed to evolve the formula or the storyline after assuring people that we were going to move past the Mishima saga in 7. Like, in spite of like all the goodwill from fans, everything they did like in 7, getting so much support and love, like they went back on all of it, right? For Tekken 8, they introduced battle passes. They introduced microtransactions. They're having you pay extra money for stages even if you bought the deluxe version of the game. Not that like the deluxe version of the game should exist to begin with, but when you really look into what Tekken is doing now, when you look and see what they're doing, like when you look at like Harada's statements on Twitter, when you see like how concerned fans are, when you see just how tepid the reception to this one has been, you see that like this is not a game that has maintained its audience whatsoever. It's a game that has just been a complete train wreck in every way, shape, and form. Like, Tekken 8 lost all of the goodwill that 7 had. And because of the decisions they made in regards to, like, the microtransactions and, like, the exploitation of the audience, I think it's safe to say that, like, I will no longer be supporting the Tekken IP. Like, Namco completely dropped the ball with this one. And this is something that we really desperately need to acknowledge and talk about. Tekken is done. In any other circumstances, Dragon Quest III would probably have been one of my favorite games of the year. I was really looking forward to this. I really thought this was going to be like a really good return to form for Dragon Quest. I thought this would like expose an audience to the classic of Dragon Quest III. I was so excited about this game. So excited about it. Imagine my disappointment when I realized that Sweet Baby Incorporated got their grubby little paws on it. They did everything they could to ruin this classic. In regards to censorship, in regards to like script changes, in regards to removing male and female body types in favor of that like type A and type 2 shit or whatever they do. Like, this was completely unacceptable. So much so that I have decided to completely boycott the game and not support it. And I have been telling my audience to do the same. And hopefully, the core Japanese audience responds in turn, right? I've heard nothing but bad things about this game from established fans. I've heard people speaking out about this. And it really needs to be understood that not only do we need to boycott Dragon Quest III, we need to boycott Square Enix as a whole. So no Romancing Saga 2, no Neo Fantasian, they're remaking Dragon Quest 1 and 2 as well. Like, how badly are they going to butcher those games, right? And what about the future of the franchise? Like, do we want this to keep continuing? The answer is no. Right? And we really do need to put a stop to this shit. Like, immediately. Do not buy this and do not support it. One of the disappointing things about this hardcore gaming season was seeing just how many people came out to shill for Silent Hill 2 Remake. So many people who should have known better came out and tried to call this game better than the original, that it was some major masterpiece, that Konami was back, that Bloober Team really hit it out of the park, and even to someone like myself, who was not a fan of the original, I could see through this immediately. And I think most people kind of feel the same way. But that initial wave, right, of people like doing damage control for this game, downplaying all the changes, they got the original developers to come out and like try to shill for it. Just like they did for Resident Evil 4 Remake and Shinji Mikami. They tried everything they possibly could to gaslight people into thinking this was a well-received remake. But why couldn't they just do it better? Like, why couldn't they do it right? Why did they have, like, modern sensibilities? Why didn't they just make a good modern like remake of the original. Just the same exact thing, but you know, I had no faith in them to begin with. Honestly, I would have rather them just re-release the original with no changes, right? Nobody wanted this. And yet, for some reason, they decided to do it anyway. It's appalling to me. And hopefully with time, much like Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake, people begin to come out and like start acknowledging this game and its problems. To me, it couldn't be more obvious that like the audience for these remakes are not the people who actually play and enjoy the original games. To me, it seems like the people who unironically like think Silent Hill 2 Remake is good are people who really didn't understand anything about the original to begin with, who really don't know anything about it. And that's my perspective on it. You know, as someone who's not like really engaged with the Silent Hill community, it feels like the people who are enabling this are only doing so in order to fit in order to like, yo, Silent Hill 2 is the greatest game ever. I'm such a huge fan of the like. They have no real understanding of what made the original so good to begin with. To me, like that mindset really needs to be disregarded and should be condemned by fans. I don't think this game deserves any respect whatsoever. Imagine being so starved for games that you start hyping up an exclusive purely because the female characters are somewhat attractive. Imagine being so down bad that you buy a PS5 just to see Eve in her skin-tight, like, spacesuit. Never mind that, like, better-looking characters on Nintendo hardware exist. Never mind that Sony in general has a policy against this kind of thing. Never mind the censorship. Never mind the game itself sucks shit. And, never mind all of that. Let's just hype this game up because we have nothing else to play. That is the PlayStation audience. This was one of the year's most embarrassing releases for that reason, is that the Coomers could not shut up about how much they wanted to bang Eve. When you really get down to it, that is the only reason anybody cared about this at all. Early this year, I gave a statement about how Splatoon 3 Side Order was one of my most anticipated games of 2024. I had loved Splatoon 2 Octopass. I considered it one of the best single-player shooter campaigns we've ever gotten. I considered it a masterpiece. It's one of my favorite Nintendo things ever, right? Octopass expansion was an indication of just how good Splatoon is going to be, right? And for Splatoon 3 as a whole, there was no evolution for that, right? Splatoon 3 did a really poor job advancing like the lore and the setting and doing anything new or fresh and exciting. And for people like me, it felt as if we were waiting for the DLC, right? It felt like the expansion was going to like really give the game a lot of new life and give it new mechanics and stuff like that. And it did when it finally came out 2 years later. But what we got was this really boring, uninspired, roguelike structure where you just run around these plain rooms fighting enemies endlessly, right? There was no creativity, there was no charm, there was no appeal to it. The story wasn't interesting, right? When you really get down to it, like everything about this DLC is honestly some of the worst content Nintendo has produced ever. Like, it's such a weird, like, contrast, especially since, like, generally speaking, I really, really, really did enjoy Splatoon 3 as a whole, but when you really look at, like, how they handled the characters, the story, the general gameplay structure, like, all of this is stuff that I hate. Like, I cannot stand anything about the expansion, to the point where I have never once been tempted to return to it. Like, I've gone back to Splatoon 3, like, several times after this DLC launched. I have never felt the urge to go back and play this again. Like, every single time I think about it, I'm just kind of like, ugh. And there are like reasons outside of the core game design for that reaction. There are some weird localization changes where they try to pass off like one of the characters as non-binary, and the stupid like Yuri shit between Pearl and Marina gets really annoying. Like, there's all of that was like just just ruined the localization of something that probably wasn't all that good to begin with. It's just so grating to see like the absolute worst of Nintendo just go completely unnoticed. Like this is like the big thing that I feel about this game in particular is that like I don't see enough people like really acknowledge how bad this game actually is. Like I really don't see it. And I suppose it gets buried under like the criticism that like Splatoon 3 like did not deserve to have, but it's worth pointing out just how awful this was to begin with. Like there is just nothing good about Side Order at all. Like it is a complete and total disaster, and hopefully Nintendo moves away from this with the sequels. If Stellar Blade was the counterculture for the Coomers, this is the counterculture release for the FPS crowd. You know, the alt-right, like the scum that hate PlayStation's like woke direction. Like, oh, we're all just gonna rally behind unironic fascism because we hate woke PlayStation so much. So for some reason, people looked at this like no-name Starship Troopers knockoff product about some guys going on planets and fighting bugs. Like they tried to make this out to be some like stellar, like high quality release, right? They tried to say this was one of the best games of the year in like February or whatever it came out. And people bought on into it because they had nothing else to play. And for a while there, this was all anybody could talk about or play was because there was nothing else, right? It was like the knack of its time. It's something that like came out, garnered an audience that would worship it, but over a period of time with the company's inability to keep up with like the demands of the audience, with like balancing issues, with just the sheer repetitiveness of the game, because of like some woke backlash, you know, Grums like spoke out about this. Like what ends up happening is that the game just kind of like gradually faded away to the point where like you don't even really see anybody talk about it anymore when this was supposedly one of the biggest releases of the year, right? So to me, it's going to be really interesting seeing this game gradually fall off, you know, the way that like Killzone or Horizon fell off. Like it reminds me a lot of that, where this is something that the community worships and like wants to see succeed and wants to like stand for something that it really doesn't, right? They really thought this was some epic own against the wokies, right? This was some epic like political statement game. And they rallied behind it for that reason. But at the end of the day, like what actually matters is the actual gameplay. You know, like people make this mistake. I keep saying this all the time. You can't judge games based on the political opinions of the developers. So even if Helldivers was based, even if they were all voting for Trump, even though they're like, I don't know, from the Netherlands or something, even if they all were like illegally voting for Trump, like that doesn't make them better than other developers, right? Like they at their core they did not produce a very good game. And there was this very stubborn refusal from the community to acknowledge that or talk about that at all. They just kept making excuse after excuse after excuse for a long time until it all collapsed within by March. By the time that like something else came out and distracted people and everyone just forgot this game ever existed. This was one of the major embarrassments of the year. Speaking of games that were only propped up out of this idea that they were somehow anti-woke, Black Myth Wukong is a really good example of just how a mediocre product will be propped up and worshipped simply for not falling in line with Western game development values. It doesn't matter that we've gotten better Journey to the West products in the past. It doesn't matter that it's a played out story, that the game isn't very good, that it's a rehash of us from Slop, that the game just doesn't really have anything going for it, that it's not all that impressive, that it's not all that fun to play. Like what matters is that like, oh man, it has attractive ladies in it. So that means it's better. Like instead of like really processing what you're looking at and realizing that like, wait a minute, this isn't very good. And I've been saying this since this game was announced. And I do feel like people need to understand this. I don't believe this is a game that the gaming establishment wanted to fail. If that was true, they wouldn't be talking about it at the Game Awards now, right? Like, if that was true, you wouldn't be hearing about it at all. You know, the way that they don't talk about Nintendo products, right? Like, if that was, like, this idea that this game is unpopular with game journals seems to have no merit at all. And yet the audience keeps, like, repeating that over and over and over again, as if it, like, means something, or as if, like, this is a game that left an impact. Like, it sold 20 million units. Yeah, to a Chinese audience. So, like, again, I feel like people don't understand that, like, Journey to the West is their thing. It's gonna do well no matter what. And, like, I don't think necessarily that really has much of a bearing on how we should discuss it. Like, who cares how many units it sells or how much money it makes? Like, is the game good? Is the question we should be bringing up. And this is the thing that gets these people every single time. Like, in regards to Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3 and this and everything else on the list. Like, when you really get down to it, like, these games are not very good. The fact that, like, you're looking at this game and you're talking about, like, political culture and, like, the Western gaming sphere and, like, the propaganda and the narratives that they put out there in regards to certain products, you're not talking about the actual game. And that's the really strong indication I get by looking at Black Myth Wukong, is that the actual game has not left an impression on anyone. This is not a good adaptation of Journey to the West. It's not going to be remembered as an adequate video game adaptation. It's not going to be, like, remembered as this massive Game of the Year contender thing. Right? No, this is just another flavor of the month from Slop Clone. One of the things I've been trying to do in regards to the gaming space is kind of emphasize how, like, the politicalization of games has resulted in people, like, making fun of certain titles and ignoring others, right? So for this year, the big target for anti-SJW, like, anti-woke content creators has been Concord, the biggest failure in PlayStation's history, right? It spent like 8 years, $800 million in development to produce this game that bombed instantly. Nobody liked it. Nobody enjoyed it. And instead of asking why, pointing out the gameplay mechanics, the flaws in the design, like, things like that, instead people pointed to, like, unappealing character designs and, like, the wokeness of PlayStation as a whole as a justification as to why it failed. When really, I don't necessarily think that's the core problem. And honestly is something that I wish wasn't really talked about in game dev circles at all, right? Like, I think we should be advocating for, talking about the games themselves and not, like, the developers' political opinions or how they may influence game design decisions. To me, like, the obsession with hating Concord didn't really make any sense, even though the game is clearly very terrible. And again, this is kind of the issue when it comes to woke, anti-woke stuff, is that they're not wrong when talking about how these games are getting worse, but what's often the case is that they don't necessarily know why, because this was a problem long before Concord. It was long before woke culture took over, right? Like, that isn't really the problem. And yet you constantly see these people, like, acting like it is. To me, like, Concord is an example of just how PlayStation just cannot create new IPs. They can't innovate or do anything new that we haven't seen before. They can't improve on old formulas or grow their brands in any meaningful capacity. So, like, when you look at that history with franchises like Jak and Daxter and Uncharted and The Last of Us, like, why would you even bother with a new PlayStation exclusive? That's what I want to know. And to me, like, I lost faith in the brand a long time ago. So to me, I think that's, like, a way stronger reason to not support their new IPs. To me, I think PlayStation does a lot worse than this. To me, I don't necessarily think this is one of the worst releases of the year. But then again, nobody thinks that because nobody actually played it. Elden Ring has been one of the most overhyped titles in the 2020s. People assured me right from the get-go that the DLC would be game of the year. This would be some major milestone in gaming. This would like prove that. I remember people saying that like Shadows of the Erdtree would outperform The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. Like when it came out in 2022. But not only did FromSlop delay their game a year so they wouldn't have to compete with Zelda, the actual final product that took 2 years to make was an underwhelming mess filled with rehashed content, boring boss fights, and really unfortunate deep lore implications. Elden Ring, for those who are willing to admit it, has been a complete and total failure. This DLC has not done enough to keep the IP interesting to audiences. If anything, this is the beginning of people realizing that the story to these games is really kind of stupid and makes no inherent sense, and that the developers will make lore changes to appease online audiences, to do something to invoke a reaction, right? They really do just make this stuff up as they go along. And most people like don't like to admit it. Most people tend to think that like, no, there's some deep purpose to this. George R.R. Martin wouldn't write a story with no ending, right? Like, these people clearly don't understand just how FromSlop is just not very competitive with its core competition, which is, of course, the Legend of Zelda franchise. They don't understand that, like, Nintendo has way more technically demanding mechanics, that they can evolve more, that they can put out more games, that they can, tackle different genres even within the same franchise. Like, FromSlop at its core is the same thing over and over and over again, to the point where people get upset if they deviate from that even a little bit. Just look at how people reacted to Armored Core 6. So, like, seeing Shadows of the Erdtree just kind of quietly burn out, just like the first Flame, has been a really exciting thing for me personally, because it really showcases just how FromSlop is going to be remembered among the masses, right? This is something that's only popular because everyone else is playing it. The instant that, like, people come out and make statements about how they're not having fun with these games and how they're not very good and how old games were better, the entire thing kind of collapses. And you can kind of see early signs of that already with people who aren't like super hardcore fans. And to me, this is an indication that the FromSlop formula is beginning to burn out. Square Enix is so incompetent, they somehow managed to bungle a remake of Final Fantasy VII. And that fact, that the decision they made a decade ago, is finally paying its dividends, right? The mistakes they made a decade ago in regards to making the game episodic, in padding everything out, it really is killing any fan enthusiasm for this thing, because this is a game we really should have bought and played already. They should not have done this. They should have just made a straight remake. But instead we get this stupid, like, reimagined fanfiction thing of, like, with the time jannies and all this crazy stuff. Like, the game is just a complete and total train wreck that no serious fan would ever seriously consider supporting. This was a mistake from the get-go. Now, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a game that I've been talking a lot about on the channel. I've always maintained that, like, the Final Fantasy VII Remake series would fail. I knew this was a big, like, problem for Square that would, like, caused them issues for years. But the counterpoint to that, the thing that everyone always brought up, was that, like, well, Final Fantasy XIV prints money. Like, Square can't go bankrupt because people can't stop playing this MMO. That might not be true anymore after the disastrous launch of Final Fantasy XIV John Trail, in which everyone hates it. Like, nobody but the most hardcore of tranny cocksucking shills really thought this was a good idea whatsoever, right? This expansion really exposes the house of cards that Square Enix has built with Final Fantasy XIV. Like, what are you going to do if you don't like the expansion? Just play the other things? Like, again, Final Fantasy XIV was never good to begin with, but for the longest time, people have been pretending like this is like some premier MMO and some really major accomplishment to gaming and just this huge thing, this huge deal. And I think this expansion just kind of demonstrates that's not true, right? To me, it feels like MMORPG fans just aren't willing to accept that their preferred genre is just inherently cancer, right? Instead of having a game that just comes out and is finished and you can just play it at leisure, like, no, man, the game is constantly updating with new contents, and you have to spend dozens of hours grinding for materials so you can complete these quests that don't mean or do anything, right? Like, to me, I think it's impossible to keep an MMO like high quality for a long period of time because people are going to leave the project. The quality is going to go down, and lore changes are going to be made. And I think that's like the big thing that really impacts Dawn Trail specifically is that the overarching story that people claim to be into, claim to care about, has been completely ruined by the addition of the new character like Wukong, who is so unpopular that absolutely nobody has anything nice to say about it at all. And, right now, like, Yoshi P is doing damage control for the game. He's trying to say that, like, the mistakes that they made will be fixed. But I think the reality of the situation is that there is no fixing Final Fantasy XIV. This game has already made a critical mistake, and the mistakes they have to fix are going to have to be built on top of it, right? Like, it was crazy to me how like people seriously damage controlled the reboot of Final Fantasy XIV to begin with. But when it comes to Dawn Trail, when it comes to these endless controversies for this game, like how exactly are you going to keep your game relevant if new players like myself keep getting scared off by just all of this pointless nonsense that doesn't make any sense and just I don't want to see in my games? When I see that you hire a tranny to voice a female character, not only am I not going to buy your game, I'm not going to buy anything else you produce. So, no. I'm completely done with Final Fantasy. I'm completely done with Squaresoft. I'm completely done with Square Enix. I'm completely done with Yoshi P, who I wish people would shit on more. And people really do need to start ending their subscriptions to Final Fantasy XIV because this is not a game that's going to get any better. Imagine being a PlayStation owner and seriously trying to tell your melanated buddies that like, oh man, Astro Bot, it's such a great game. It's the best platformer ever made. Like, oh, like seriously imagine trying to tell people that this game outperformed Mario. That was seriously the line of thought, that this game had better controls, it had better mechanics, better visuals, better style. Like, it was just a better game in general than any other 3D platformer ever. Like, people were seriously trying to say this was like the best platformer ever made. And immediately, real platforming fans kind of called them out on it. Because the people saying this were people who have spent the past, 20 years, going after every major Nintendo platformer that came out, whether it was like Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong 64, Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, the list goes on and on and on. You're really telling me that Astro Bot is better than all of that? And of course, real Nintendo fans rejected this narrative immediately, but game journos were really pushing this line of thinking for weeks after this came out. I saw some of them say this game outperformed every other 3D platformer this generation, which isn't true. People were saying it was better than Nintendo. People were hyping up the crossover aspects, even though that Super Smash Bros. Does that better. There's nothing about Astro Bot that is new or interesting. To a Nintendo fan, all of this looks really familiar to the point where I really don't understand why anybody would really get excited about this at all. To me, this is a really good example of just how PlayStation fans are willing to swallow up slop because they really have no idea what's actually out there. If you were a real fan of platformers, if you really enjoyed games like this, you would own a Nintendo Switch, and you would own the better games in this already, right? You wouldn't say something so arbitrary as pretending that, like, say, oh, this the final stage in Astro Bot is harder than any Mario level, when really it's just a basic Mario Galaxy stage, right? Like, it's just sad to see people worship this game the way they did. Imagine producing a Splatoon knockoff and then getting upset at fans for calling you out on what you did. Foamstars is the very pinnacle of example of why you cannot take what third parties say or do seriously, right? This was supposed to be Square Enix's answer to Splatoon. And what happens? It looks so derivative and uninspired and boring with no real creativity or charm to it at all that the Splatoon audience immediately just laughed at it and called it ridiculous, right? Like, this goes to show you just how well made of an IP Splatoon actually is, where it comes off as universally more appealing, it comes off as fresh and exciting. Even today, that's true. And then you see this knockoff product, and you're just like, unbelievable. Like, even Angry Joe said this was a knockoff, and he had to back off of that statement because, like, he's not supposed to say anything nice about Nintendo, right? But when even Angry Joe is calling this a ripoff, you really do have this sense of just like, wow, unbelievable. And of course, like, people called this out for the people. Nobody bought this game, nobody played it, but there just is no denying that Splatoon's legacy on gaming has resulted in games like this being produced. Splatoon is huge in Japan right now, and I think it will eventually, like, grow to be as big or bigger in the US as well. So seeing something like this fail the way it has, it really shows just how ingrained Splatoon is in the popular culture, and just how Square Enix can never, ever, ever do anything to replicate that. If ever a series has long outlasted its welcome, it's the Yakuza games. When the series outgrows its main protagonist and it has to start expanding through other avenues, yeah, you would think they would branch out into a character that's already established, or actually has some appeal, or someone that actually likes. Now, instead they come up with this Ichiban guy who nobody likes, nobody cares about, and tries to do the same thing, but like, ooh, just with a different protagonist. And now we're in a different location. We're in Hawaii now. Like, it's the same exact thing, but with no creativity, no charm. The story is a step down from Like a Dragon 1. In general, like, the Yakuza IP feels like it's been stagnant for a long time, since like 5. Like, in a lot of ways, it feels like 7 just came out, and we're already getting a sequel, and now it feels as if the series is just running out of steam. I haven't heard anyone say anything nice about this game since it came out, and they're already putting out like a DLC expansion with like Majima as a pirate. It's just like, come on, like, why don't you just do something new? Why don't you actually fix your combat? Why don't you actually, like, get writers who know what they're doing? You know, like, why even keep producing these games? Why do people keep buying them? Right? To me, it's just, this is an IP that's outstood its welcome for quite a long time, and I really can't wait to see the series just finally start to fall off, because this is something that should have gone away a long time ago. Traditionally, game journalists have always been very critical of JRPGs. Back in the day, they propped up BioWare over them and tried to say that JRPGs weren't real JRPGs. And with Metaphor ReFantazio, they tried backtracking on that in a big way. And I think the reason for that being that Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that panders to them. This is a game all about racism and how different groups of people are oppressed. And so woke SJW game journalists love to prop this up as the best thing in the genre when it kind of comes off like Persona 5's like edgy teenager writing an anime kind of thing. Like it to me, Atlus is a studio that's on the way out, right? They are clearly in decline. They're being influenced by the higher-ups at Sega, and they're making all these decisions that they would not have made 10, 20 years ago. And Persona 3 Reload is a good example of that, but I think this is the first new game that we've seen from them that seems to be taking in a lot of woke globalist aspects to it. It does need to be addressed. It does need to be talked about. This is an example of a woke JRPG. It's time we talk about the big Nintendo L of the year. The long-awaited Endless Ocean 3, a game that we've been waiting a decade for, comes out and it is a complete middling mess that makes no sense to anybody and is a complete departure for what made the first two games so memorable and interesting. Instead of exploring a wide open ocean with lots of things to find and do and discover, you are exploring a stale, boring, randomly generated ecosystem that just has really nothing cool or interesting to find outside of some randomly generated things that don't feel natural or organic or interesting. Like, the game seems built around these randomly generated concepts, and you have to gradually unlock them as you proceed through the game. So if you're like me and only put like 5 hours or so into it, you're not going to unlock the cooler locations or things. Like, why do I have to unlock things that are in the ocean? It doesn't make any sense. And it is so frustrating because this is a game that I really wanted to do well. This was something I was pulling for. This was something I was supporting. I really wanted this to be a W for Endless Ocean fans. But when you really look at what the game delivers and its features and just, no, like, it failed at things that the first two games accomplished like a decade ago. If we ever get a sequel, and I hope we do, hopefully the development team understands what people actually want and deliver on this, right? This should be a game about exploring an open ocean. I don't want to be relegated to tiny zones. I don't want randomly generated aspects to it. I don't want like a story that's not very well thought out or interesting, right? Like, I want a diving sim, and they really need to deliver that for us. Much like Dragon Quest III HD, Atlus and Sega decided to take it upon themselves to wokeify Persona 3, removing a lot of dialogue and editing things into the opening cinematics, right? This is unacceptable. I don't want wokeness in any of my games, and as a result of that, I will not be supporting Atlus or Persona going forward. What a fall from grace. What was once considered the greatest of all time in my generation, the Paper Mario, the Thousand Year Door, has completely blundered onto Nintendo Switch with worse looking graphics, with worse gameplay, with rebalancing changes that nobody asked for, with a new localization that ruins a lot of themes and concepts and ideas of the original localization. This game was overrated to begin with. But looking at it now, looking at just what a train wreck this version was, this has to be the single most disappointing release of the year, right? It is so insane how they could take a straight up classic like this and butcher it so badly. And this is a game that's very heavy on the dialogue and the jokes and things like that, the continuity. So seeing like the developers try and like redo it and try and like wokeify it was a complete and utter train wreck. Like, you know, ruining entire character arcs, ruining lines of dialogue, ruining certain jokes. To me, and I think this is something that a lot of people will agree with when they go back and play it. The original English translation is far superior, to the point where I have a hard time recommending this version to anyone, unless you really, really want to fight the super bonus bosses at the end. And that is something you'll only want to do if you're a hardcore fan of the original, I think. But for like everyone else, like there's no reason not to pick up the GameCube version over this. It's so much more appealing. It was so much well put together. It was so engaging and so exciting. Like it's just a better game in general. And this remake is really one that I wish more people would condemn for what it is. This is something that we don't see from Nintendo often, which is a lazy cash grab remake that does very little to improve on the original release. Surprising absolutely no one, Palworld is the worst game of 2024. I can't think of anything else that was propped up as much as this to downplay any Nintendo product this year. And the fact that they thought to go after Pokemon, to me, is laughable. The fact that they seriously tried pushing this narrative that this game was somehow bigger or more successful than Pokemon, that this was an actual genuine threat to Nintendo, is and always has been laughable. And now that we're seeing the chickens come home to roost, Nintendo has filed that lawsuit, and they are going after the developer. After we were assured by the gaming industry that it would not happen and that Nintendo didn't have a case, this is a game that won't even exist a couple of years from now. It's not going to get any sequels. It's not going to get that anime adaptation. It's not going to get merchandise. This is an IP that was only ever relevant or propped up purely because of the Pokemon plagiarism. And for me, nothing could be more pathetic that they seriously tried and to take advantage of the Pokemon company in this way. I could not be happier that these people, quote unquote, are going to get reamed. Well, there you have it. The very absolute worst games of 2024. This year was a complete train wreck, but with a new Nintendo console on the horizon and more of these third-party studios going bankrupt all the time, and more people rejecting the PlayStation and Xbox platforms, and PC gaming becoming irrelevant, things are going to get better. 2025 already looks far superior with games like Metroid Prime 4 and Donkey Kong Country Returns HD and Atelier Yumiya and endless amounts of like cool, new, interesting titles coming out. But it remains to be seen just what the end of the year is going to look like. As of this recording, I actually still don't know what the next Nintendo console is going to be. So that feeling of anticipation for a new platform release, it's very exciting, and it's something that we're all looking forward to. But we still have to talk about the best games of 2024. The absolute best games on Nintendo Switch, which of course is superior to the other platforms. We will be talking the top 10 games of 2024 in the Mario's Award Show. I will see you all then.